welcome back to another video. If you aren't familiar with me, I am Baker Betty and I'm a trained chef and baking instructor, and welcome to my channel. I hope you will stick around for a little while and subscribe. Now today I have a new sourdough recipe for you, and it is for my really soft and fluffy sourdough sandwich bread. Now this recipe is super versatile. It can actually be made in one day, or you can make the dough one day and put it in the refrigerator for up to 4 days to bake when you are ready for it. So the timeline is super flexible and versatile. You can see all of the written instructions linked below, and I also give some example timelines in the written post. But let's go ahead and dive into making the recipe. So in my demo here, I am making a full batch of dough, which is going to make 2 loaves of bread. But the written post linked below will give amounts for a single loaf of bread as well. So to make our dough, we are going to start with 650 grams of water that is just slightly warm, about 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 32 to 35 degrees Celsius. You do not want this water to be hot. Next, I am adding in my starter that is fully active and mature. You can see here how bubbly it is. I actually fed this last night before I went to bed so that I could mix my dough first thing in the morning. Now the written post is also going to give example timelines for the whole schedule of your bread. So I am adding in 300 grams of this active starter for the full batch of dough. And to get enough for my dough, I fed 50 grams of starter with 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water. This gave me 350 grams of total starter, so 300 of that is going into my dough, and I will have 50 grams left for tomorrow's feeding or to store back in the refrigerator for my next bake. Now go ahead and stir that up just a bit to break the starter up in the water. Next, add 1,000 grams of bread flour into the bowl, along with 20 grams of kosher salt or fine sea salt, 40 grams of sugar, or sometimes I will use honey instead. And lastly, 50 grams of a neutral oil, something like avocado oil or canola oil or vegetable oil. Now the oil is what is going to help our bread be a more tender texture. This is in contrast to most sourdough recipes that do not contain any fat in them at all. I like to start the mixing with my rubber spatula to get it to start to come together before switching to clean hands to finish the mixing. I find that people often don't mix quite enough, so you're going to want to really get in there and squeeze and massage the dough with your fingers until you find no more patches of flour. This should take at least 2 full minutes of mixing. You can see here that the dough is really sticky and shaggy. It's not going to hold together into a cohesive ball at this point. We're just trying to make sure that everything is evenly combined. Okay, now go ahead and cover your bowl. I like to use a shower cap for this, and let it sit at room temperature, about 72 to 74 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 22 to 23 degrees Celsius. Let it sit there for about 30 minutes. Now we are going to perform our first round of stretch and folds. So go ahead and wet your hand and then get your hand under the dough and pull up on it as far as it will go without breaking, and fold it down over itself. Now turn the bowl and continue stretching and folding the dough over itself a few times around until it tightens up into a ball like you see here. This gives our dough structure and starts developing the gluten, and you can see how different it looks just from one round of stretch and folds. Now cover the bowl and wait about 30 more minutes until we will come back and do our next round. Okay, now it is time for round 2 of stretch and folds. This time you don't need to do as many. I typically only go around the bowl about 1 full time because the dough has more structure now. Again, cover the bowl, let it rest for 30 more minutes, and you are going to do 4 full rounds of stretch and folds spaced out about 30 minutes in between. The timing of this doesn't need to be exact, but you want to try to get them all in about the first 2 hours after mixing, with a bit of time in between each for resting and letting the gluten relax. After you finish your last round of stretch and folds, cover the bowl again, and we're going to let it finish bulk fermenting. So you have two options here. You can let it sit out at room temperature if you want to bake your bread the same day you mix the dough, or you can place the dough in the refrigerator for up to 4 days to bake later. This can give you a lot of flexibility in the timing of your dough, and it also really increases the flavor and sourness when it sits in the fridge. I actually recommend taking half of the dough out to bake the same day and then put the other half in the refrigerator. You can bake the one loaf the day you made the dough, and then when you're finished eating that loaf, you have another one in the refrigerator ready to go and to be baked. You can also make another half batch of dough on the day you pull the one out of the refrigerator to bake, so you kind of always have this rotation on hand to have fresh sandwich bread all of the time. If you are baking your bread the same day, let it bulk ferment for about 3 hours. If you refrigerated your dough, you're going to take it out of the fridge and let it sit at room temperature for about 5 to 6 hours before shaping. Your dough is done bulk fermenting when it looks puffy. You can tell that there's some air in it. There are some bubbles on top, and it looks rounded on the sides of the bowl. It likely won't double in size the way a bread dough made with dry yeast does. Prep your loaf pans with nonstick spray. These are 1-pound loaf pans, and then set those aside. Now lightly flour your countertop and pour your dough out onto it. If you made a full batch of dough, we are going to divide it in half. So I like to sprinkle a little flour down the middle of the dough and then use my bench knife to cut it in half. Okay, take one piece of dough shaped into about a rectangle and then very, very lightly flour the top. You don't want to use a lot of flour here, just enough to make it easy to handle. To shape the dough, we're going to stretch the top of it out and then fold it down into the center, gently pressing to seal. Now stretch the bottom of the dough out and bring that up into the center, gently pressing to seal. Now stretch one side out and into the center, then the opposite side out and into the center, forming a log. I like to finish my shaping by sealing the ends, and then I stitch the dough down the center of the seam so that I just get a tighter log and a little bit more tension on the dough. Now transfer the shaped loaf seam side down into your prepared pan. Gently press down on it to evenly distribute and press out any air pockets. Now you can shape your second loaf. This dough is somewhat sticky and can be a bit tricky to work with. Use a very gentle and light touch. You don't want to squeeze the dough too much, or it's just going to stick to your fingers way too much. You can also use a bit of flour where needed, but just be really light with it. You don't want to overly flour your dough, or it's not going to stick to itself when you shape it. This second loaf was already much tighter and had more tension in it, so I actually skipped the stitching step this time. Now cover your loaf tins and let them proof at room temperature. My room sits around 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 22 degrees Celsius, so this usually takes about 2.5 hours for my loaves to fully proof after shaping. But if your room is warmer, this is going to go quicker, or if your room is cooler, it's going to take a bit longer. The more you make this recipe, the better you will get a feel for how the timing works for you. Sourdough is always an individualized process, so just keep that in mind. About 45 minutes before baking, prep your oven with a baking stone on the center rack. Now, if you don't have a baking stone, you can use 2 sheet pans stacked together. And then put a roasting pan on the rack underneath with about 2 cups of water in it. Do not use a glass pan for this. This is going to help create a steamy environment in our oven. Preheat your oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. To check if your dough is done proofing, get a floured finger and gently press down into it. If it immediately fills back in and the dough feels like it has a lot of tension in it, it is going to need more time to proof. If the hole fills back in very slowly and the tension is a little more relaxed, then you are ready to bake. If the dough feels like it might collapse, you have gone too far with your proofing, and it's probably going to be a pretty dense loaf. My dough still felt a tiny bit tense, so I let it go just a bit longer. But when you are ready to bake, we are going to spray the top of our loaves with some water. Now, if you don't have a spray bottle, you can just use your fingers and kind of flick some water over the top. This is going to help them steam a little more and get even more rise in the oven. Transfer the loaves to the preheated baking stone and bake with steam for 15 minutes. Now, after 15 minutes, carefully take the steam pan out of the oven. I like to place a towel over the glass on my oven in case any water splashes on it so I don't shatter the glass. I also like to rotate the loaves at this point for more even browning. Continue baking your loaves for about 20 to 25 more minutes until golden brown. They should sound hollow when you knock on them, and if you are unsure if they are done, you can also check with a thermometer. I stick it right into the side of the loaf into the center, and it should read at least 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees Celsius. Remove from the oven and onto a cooling rack and carefully tip the loaves out of the pan to cool completely. Please wait for your loaves to cool completely before slicing. I know that is the hardest part of this process, but you worked so hard to create these beautiful loaves of bread, and this is going to really help keep the moisture in your bread so that they don't stale really quickly. And if you are someone who often gets a gummy texture in your bread, usually that is because you have sliced it too early. That can really make the texture be off. The crust is going to be pretty crispy when they first come out of the oven, but it will soften as they cool. Once you do slice into your bread, you can slice the whole thing and just store it in a plastic bag at room temperature for up to 3 days. Then I go ahead and transfer it to the freezer, and I will refresh it in the toaster straight from the freezer. This is the perfect bread for a BLT sandwich. That is my favorite thing to do with it. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this recipe tutorial, and if you did, if you give it a thumbs up, that would really help my channel out. And if you have any questions, you can leave those down in the comment section. I always try my best to answer them. And if you aren't already following me on Instagram and on Facebook, you can find me at Baker Bettie, and I'll see you back here next time with another baking tutorial.